Thank you very much, Professor Cornejo, for joining our interview series. Let me start with the first question. Can you provide an overview of the historical development of populist movements in Mexico? How have these movements evolved over the past few decades? Especially how do left-wing and right-wing populism manifest differently in Mexico, and what are the unique characteristics and strategies of each within the Mexican political context?
Yeah, it's an interesting moment in Mexico politics because, well, there was a presidential election literally the last few days. I would say populism in Mexico is basically Andrés Manuel López Obrador, who is the current president. He ran for the first time for the presidency in 2006, then 2012, then 2018, finally won the presidency in 2018. And he has consistently divided Mexican society, I mean, in a very populist way, into a corrupt elite, which were the former political parties, the mainstream political parties, the PAN and the PRI, and the people, well, which are like definitions of populism, are the good people, and his movement is going to represent Morena, is going to represent the people. The interesting part about this is that, well, Mexico had an hegemonic regime and a non-democratic hegemonic regime between the 1930s and the 2000s. Eventually, there was a transition to democracy in the 2000s. López Obrador was always very critical about this transition to democracy, not because of the transition of democracy, but it was a very, let's say, not the true democracy that was initiated in 2000 in Mexico, but it was a very neoliberal democracy. Democracy only for a few people, only for a few political parties, which were the PAN and the PRI, and well, he was extremely critical of that. Especially the PAN and the PRI eventually were very successful to approve some neoliberal reforms between the 2012 and 2015, and that was a major moment for López Obrador. He was very close to win the presidency in 2006. Eventually, in his second campaign, he was not that successful, 2012, but the approval of these legislative reforms, which were highly neoliberal, and also huge corruption scandals during the pre-government of that moment, definitely made possible the return of López Obrador as a very strong political leader. And he was, the momentum was there in the sense that, okay, did you see all the huge corruption in this government? Did you see all of these neoliberal reforms? Did you see all, I don't know, the liberalization of oil prices in Mexico? And in some way, he tapped that anger in Mexican society against mainstream political parties, and that's why he was very successful and winning in his third presidential campaign in 2018 with more than 50% of the vote, which was historical in Mexico. And now in 2024, a few weeks ago, he was unable to campaign again because re-election is banned in Mexico. But one of the probably the most loyal politician in Mexico in terms of López Obradorismo, close to his movement, Claudia Sheinbaum, which was the former mayor of Mexico City, won with almost 60% of the vote in the last presidential election. And she campaigned with, as you can expect, as a loyal in terms of I'm going to continue what López Obrador has made in the last 6 years. And well, here we are.
Right. What has been the impact of populist rhetoric and strategies on recent Mexican elections? How have populist leaders and their discourses influenced voter behavior? What are the long-term implications of these policies and discourses on Mexican society and governance?
Yeah, I think the populist rhetoric in the last decade, but most definitely in the last 6 years, has been very important, not only in general for populists or for, I don't know, every day-to-day Mexico politics, but also for voting behavior. In some of my studies that I had published, I found that affective polarization, but particularly negative partisanship against the PAN and the PRI, are the main driver of voting behavior. People are taking decisions at election time, thinking that not necessarily in the future, they're thinking in the PAN and the PRI, especially the PRI that was the perception that was a highly corrupt government. they are still punishing those political parties, even though that they have not governed at this point in the 6 years. In the last 6 years, they are still punishing their performance. And López Obrador has been very strategic about that. Literally, he has an everyday daily conference. Literally, he talks for hours, maybe on average, probably 2 hours every morning. And he keeps talking about the pan and the PRI, the government 6 years ago, 12 years ago, 18 years ago, etc., etc. He doesn't talk much about actual policies, daily policies, day-to-day policies of his own government. He's always talking about the past. And that has been very, very useful for him in terms of, in his government. Maybe there's a huge crisis of public insecurity in Mexico. Maybe there's a drug cartel-related violence. No, he's talking about the past always. Maybe his performance during the pandemic of his government was terrible, I should say, and that's based on factual information. Mexico was one of the worst in terms of excess death rate, in terms of the quantity of people that died during the pandemic. And no, he was talking about the pan and the PRI. So people are not really evaluating the actual performance, but they are actually evaluating in retrospection. So yeah, that has been very important for his government, the populist rhetoric.
In your article titled "The AMLO Voter: Effective Polarization and the Rise of the Left in Mexico," you suggest that effective polarization played a crucial role in López Obrador's victory in 2018 presidential election. Can you elaborate on how the use of populist rhetoric contributed to this effective polarization in Mexican politics and influenced voter behavior in recent elections and contributed to the electoral success of Claudia Sheinbaum?
Yeah, it's interesting because, again, normally you would think that, especially because there were huge corruption scandals, because, I don't know, the economy was not necessarily great before 2018 when López Obrador won. Public insecurity has not been necessarily great in Mexico. You would think that there's a lot of retrospective voting, but no. When I actually found that yes, people of course make some decisions in terms of retrospective assessments, but when you actually control by first party identification, but more importantly effective polarization, all of those, let's say, variables that we know that in general tend to influence voting behavior, they actually are not that important. Why? Because at the end, people are, I don't know, assessing the performance of the economy based on their own partisan orientations, partisan loyalties. They are judging corruption also based on a partisan bias. They are judging public insecurity in terms of a partisan bias. So at the end of the day, I found that, yes, effective polarization, particularly negative partisanship against the mainstream political parties, were the main drivers of López Obrador victory in 2018. The second most important predictor of voting for López Obrador, that's also important, is the perception that the PAN and the PRI were exactly the same. So again, the ideological, let's say, convergence of the PAN and the PRI that experienced in the last in the years previous to López Obrador's victory was also very important. Normally, the PAN and the PRI were not necessarily allies in terms of ideological allies, but in the years before López Obrador's victory, as I mentioned a few seconds ago, they approved some legislative reforms, very neoliberal, that helped to provide that perception that the PAN and the PRI were exactly the same. So again, all of those elements that were very, I don't know, very convenient for López Obrador to win the presidency in 2018 were there. Like a bad situation of the country in terms of actual factual indicators, but also political indicators that, okay, the PAN and the PRI have done not well. They look very similar, but that was the second most important variable that I found that was driving the victory of López Obrador in 2018. And again, that didn't change much. I don't have the data yet in terms of the last election, but that shouldn't change much in terms of effective polarization and negative partisanship against the PAN and the PRI are very likely to be one of the main drivers of the victory of Claudia Sheinbaum.
All right. Your article titled "Who Believes in Fraud in 2006 Mexican Presidential Election, Election Denialism, Partisan Motivated Reasoning, and Effective Polarization," emphasizes the role of effective polarization in sustaining the belief in electoral fraud during the 2016 Mexican presidential election. Could you elaborate on how effective polarization interacts with partisan identification to reinforce these misperceptions over time and in recent elections?
It's an interesting moment in Mexico politics, the 2006 presidential election. This is the first time that López Obrador ran for the presidency. He, without much evidence, to be honest, he denounced that he lost because of an electoral fraud. And that was in some way like the myth, a political myth of his political movement. At that point, he was part of the PRD, a leftist, the traditional party in Mexico. Eventually, he created his own political party, López Obrador. But that myth was particularly important during these years in the sense that not only the PAN and the PRI are incredibly neoliberal, they are corrupt, they're also they have created a lot of poverty in Mexico, but also they literally stole the presidency from me. That was a very very successful myth in terms of López Obrador. In terms of effective polarization, that's going to make López Obrador activate those grievances. It's not only about the economy, it's not only about corruption, but also activate grievances in terms of, okay, they stole the presidency from me in 2006. Again, he's going to denounce that in 2012 in his second presidential campaign. Less successful in terms of actually people believing that there was an electoral fraud, mostly because in 2006 he lost by less than 1% of the vote share. In 2012, he lost more than 5% of the vote share, so it was less likely to people to believe in an electoral fraud. But again, this is going to provide this narrative, this populist narrative throughout the years, and he's going to be very strategic. Activate those grievances during elections, and people are going to respond in many ways. And again, he's going to construct this way of an out group against the PAN and the PRI. That the populist rhetoric is going to target that, is going to activate all of these grievances, and in favor of this in-group, which is López Obradorismo, his own political party, Morena, and it's going to be eventually very successful, particularly in 2018, but also in the last presidential election.
Your 2023 study finds that emotions, particularly anger, significantly influence how voters perceive corruption involving their co-partisan candidates. How can political campaigns either mitigate or exploit these emotional responses to influence voter behavior? And what are the broader implications for political accountability in Mexico?
It's interesting because anger is going to be a main driver, of course, of political behavior, in the sense that if you feel aggravated with that particular, I don't know, corruption scandal, which there were many during the previous years of López Obrador, people are going to be angry. López Obrador is going to say, yes, the mainstream political parties are the ones that we need to blame. He's going to attribute a structural problem in Mexico in terms of corruption, and people are going to be very angry and react against this corruption scandal and vote in favor of López Obrador, punish the corruption. The problem is that, I found that in some other paper, is that, okay, our people are also going to be angry and are also going to punish the corruption of López Obrador and in general about the Morena party, his own political party? And the answer is not so much. And that is going to be a problem in terms of accountability. Yes, maybe you're angry, maybe you're going to punish the corruption of opposition parties, but the problem is that the same, I manipulated in one experiment, literally the same corruption scandal, but I just changed the source or who was the politician behind that corruption scandal, and people are not going to punish if that corruption scandal is made by a co-partisan politician. And that's the story in some way of the last 6 years in Mexico. Yes, López Obrador was very successful in 2018 to campaign against the corruption of the PAN and the PRI, but his government there were also a lot of corruption scandals, even in his own family, and people were not necessarily very aggravated, very angry about that. Even presidential approval of López Obrador has been very stable, highly stable during the last 6 years, around the 60%, which is very high. for Latin America in general, in a democracy, 60% of presidential approval. And regardless of some corruption scandals, regardless also about violence in Mexico, regardless of the economy something not doing great, regardless of the pandemic. So that's one of the problems of living in a world of affective polarization plus populist rhetoric, in the sense that people are going to use their partisan bias and be immune also to these scandals and are not going to punish their co-partisan leaders.
All right. Your article titled "How Do Campaigns Matter? Independence, Political Information, and the Enlightening Role of Campaigns in Mexico" discusses how campaigns help voters align with candidates that match their underlying political predispositions. How do populist candidates in Mexico leverage campaign strategies to appeal to independents and low information voters? And what role does populist rhetoric play in shaping these voters' political alignments?
It's interesting because in Mexico, normally on average in the last, let's say 20 years, you can see that around 50%, 60% of the people have party identification. So that's actually a high level for Latin America. So normally there are like, let's say a third of the electorate, maybe 40% of the electorate, depends on the election, but of independents. So that's what, of course, politicians are going to try to target. López Obrador, for example, well, not surprisingly, in 2006 and 2012, when he lost the presidential election, he didn't win the independent vote, partially because he was somewhat perceived as actually the opposition. At that moment, the PAN and the PRI, especially the PAN, was very successful to portray López Obrador as a threat to Mexico and a threat to Mexican democracy, and also a threat to the economy. In some way, the campaign during those years were like, if López Obrador wins the presidency, first, democracy is going to collapse, and two, the economy is also going to collapse. Eventually, López Obrador, again, because of all of these failures or not necessarily great performance of the mainstream political parties, was able to win in 2018. Yes, for the first time, he was able to win the independent vote. And again, the independent vote is highly responsive to these political events that are happening in day-to-day politics, as opposed to partisans that, well, they see everything through this partisan bias. At the very least, an important proportion of independents are going to say that, okay, if they see that there are some corruption scandals, if they see that the economy is not necessarily doing well, they're going to be responsive to those, let's say, short-term political events, and they're going to vote accordingly. And that was, at least for López Obrador, very, very convenient in 2018. In terms of 2024, the interesting part is that it was one of the most stable political campaigns probably in the recent history in terms of polling. At the beginning of the campaign, Claudia Sheinbaum, she had like 50-something% of the vote share. The second place, the second candidate from the opposition, from PAN and the pre-candidate, Xochitl Gálvez, had 30-something% of the vote share in terms of polling, and the campaign began, I don't know, like 3 months ago, something like that, and nothing changed much during these 3 months of the presidential campaign. Partially because, well, we live in a very polarized moment in Mexico politics. We live in a highly, partisan moment in Mexican politics. If 60-something% of the people have some degree of party identification, if presidential approval is in the 60s, in the 60%, if there's a highly polarized environment, so people are not going to change much their partisan orientation, and definitely they are not going to change their vote choice. So that happened mostly during the campaign. Stability, and again, this is an outcome of this polarization and populist rhetoric of Mexican politics at this point in general. And the other thing is that, well, again, Claudia Sheinbaum, Morena, won the independent vote. And again, if you actually analyze the independent vote lately in Mexico, they are highly oriented towards in favor of López Obrador and his political party, Morena. So they are less independent than they used to be in some previous campaigns. And again, it's mostly because of the, I guess, successful moment of López Obradorismo in Mexican politics at this point.
The study suggests that political campaigns serve an enlightening role, particularly for independents. How does this enlightenment process impact the support for populist candidates who often rely on broad anti-establishment messages? Do these campaigns reinforce or weaken the appeal of populist rhetoric as election day approaches?
Exactly. It's interesting because in this last presidential campaign, as opposed to the previous one, they were in government, Claudia Sheinbaum and López Obrador, 6 years of his government. So the goal of this, I mean, in some way, you cannot necessarily, well, they actually tried and they did it successfully, but not only you should rely on activation of that anger against the previous mainstream political parties, the PAN and the PRI, but another probably they tried as well to say, okay, we have a better economy. That was part of the rhetoric of Claudia Sheinbaum. We actually represent the people. That was very, very, very common in the political communication during the campaign. We actually care about the people. We created social programs. The economy also increased our government also increased the minimum wage, etc., etc. So that was definitely part of the campaign, in the sense that a contrast to the previous years of the PAN and the PRI, the super neoliberal, according to this political communication. And now we actually care about the people, and we're going to continue to care about the people, caring about the people, and also underestimating the, let's say, the democratic erosion criticism that has been very prevalent, especially from the PAN and the PRI. Like, yes, maybe you have created some social programs, but you have also tried to capture the Supreme Court. You have tried to erode the democracy. You have tried to capture electoral authorities, etc., etc. So that was part of the campaign, in the sense that how to enlighten voters. Normally, what was the main tool from the López Obrador, or in this particular case, Claudia Sheinbaum campaign, is that, okay, let's try to focus on the good things that has happened in Mexico in the last 6 years, and yes, don't forget always to campaign against the PAN and the PRI, activate that anger against those mainstream political parties.
Your study, titled "Do Perceptions of Electoral Polling Affect the Vote? Campaign Effects, Partisan Bias, and Strategic Voting in Mexico," highlights the role of partisan bias in shaping voter perceptions of electoral polling information. From a populism perspective, how do populist leaders in Mexico exploit or reinforce these biases to galvanize their base, and what impact does this have on strategic voting behavior among their supporters?
It's interesting. In the last few years of the López Obrador government, he has almost, maybe not in a daily basis, but maybe a weekly basis, he has always said, well, first the argument, we won by 50% of the vote, more than 50% of the vote, therefore we have the majority of the electorate, but also always literally showing the numbers of presidential approval. In his numbers, it was not 60%. Normally that's the average, and I think that was the accurate number, but in some surveys, López Obrador almost had 80% of presidential approval, so he was always showing those numbers in his daily conferences, daily press, and yeah, in some way saying, well, we represent the people, 80% of the presidential approval, the people are happy, so therefore we have the mandate to do what we are doing. That can be, I mean, that makes sense from any other perspective, in the sense that if you have a high presidential approval, your, I don't know, economic reforms, your political reforms are going to be I don't know, approved in Congress, and you're going to use that presidential approval to push or to pressure opposition parties. That would be normal politics. The problem sometimes is that based on this populist rhetoric, but also in this majoritarian rhetoric, not only that 80% of presidential approval helped for those purposes, legislative purposes, but also to erode democracy. And that was the problem sometimes. The Supreme Court is blocking our work, and we are going to change the way the Supreme Court is. The Supreme Court should work. I don't know. The electoral authority is not being great with us, with the López Obrador governments and the López Obrador candidates, and we're going to weaken the electoral authority. So that happened a lot in the last few years. There were constitutional reforms that López Obrador tried to approve to actively erode the independence of electoral authorities. to actually capture the Supreme Court, and was always based on these numbers of, okay, I have 80% of presidential approval. I was elected by the 50-something vote share in the last presidential election. That's why I have, I don't know, the democratic legitimacy to do that, and that was the problematic situation in this context. And again, because of this partisan bias that we mentioned before, a lot of people were convinced by yes, in the sense that, yeah, the Supreme Court is actively blocking our government. We should do something about that. The electoral authority is doing things that are not great from their own perspective, and we are going to try to change the structure or weaken the independence. And a huge part of public opinion endorses these reforms that would actively erode democracy in Mexico.
Your article titled Anti-Democratic Attitudes, the Winner-Loser Gap, and the Rise of the Left in Mexico indicates that López Obrador's supporters showed increased satisfaction with democracy after his victory, yet also exhibited a willingness to support anti-democratic interventions. How do populist leaders like López Obrador reconcile or exploit this apparent contradiction between promoting satisfaction with democracy while simultaneously undermining democratic norms and institutions?
It's interesting because, yeah, normally you would expect that people that voters that their party win the election, the last presidential election, they are going to be more satisfied with democracy. That expectation was met in the last presidential election. People in 2018, Morena partisans, López Obrador partisans, were very happy about the election, about the electoral victory, and therefore they increased their satisfaction with democracy quite a bit. But the interesting part is that they were also the most likely to endorse measures that you can define as, well, actively eroding democracy. The question is why? Like, at least from López Obrador's perception, of course, he's not going to say that we are actively going to capture or erode the Supreme Court or actively erode the independence of electoral authorities. What he's saying, and the argument, is that we are actually going to create a true democracy that is going to actually represent the people, not like those corrupt judges in the judiciary or those corrupt justices in the Supreme Court. So we are going to create an actual true democracy that is going to be going to represent you, and you have not been represented by the Supreme Court. In fact, one of the reforms that very likely is going to be discussed in Congress in September with the new Congress, with an actual majority of Morena, is that he's proposing that the judges in Mexico, including those from the Supreme Court, are going to be elected by the popular vote. And that's why the argument again is that, okay, they are now going to be they are going to represent the people because you are going to vote for them. And of course, we know that that's a way to actually politicize even more a Supreme Court or the judges. Very likely, a lot of, if this political reform of the judiciary is successful, we are going to see that, well, those judges are going to very likely respond to political interest and not necessarily the people or whatever the reform is trying to do. So yeah, so again, how do people reconcile these two ways? In some ways, because, well, first, partisan bias. Of course, they're going to trust on the source, and the source is López Obrador. But also, if democracy has not bring, I don't know, like actual benefits, at least in political ways or even in some other ways, and López Obrador is going to say that, okay, we're going to actually make that the judges actually represent the people. Well, in some way, those kind of measures are going to be somewhat successful among public opinion.
During the campaign, Claudia Sheinbaum backed many of Obrador's most contentious policies, including a slate of constitutional changes that critics say would severely undermine democratic checks and balances. Do you think she would continue the populist streak Obrador started?
I think so. That was always one of the questions during the campaign. She actively campaigned in favor of continuing López Obrador transformation, as he normally tends to call his own government. transforming Mexico politics. Claudia Sheinbaum, she was again campaigning in favor of continuing the López Obrador government. One of the questions was that is she being strategic about that? Maybe during the campaign, she's going to appear like very López Obradorista, but eventually she's going to find her own positions in many things. This last week, she reminded us that she actively endorses, for example, this reform of the Supreme Court, in which the judges are going to be elected by electoral vote. And yes, it seemed like there's a high level of degree of at least continuing, or at least maintaining all of these López Obrador reforms in terms of democratic erosion, in terms of weakening checks and balances. So it seems like it's going to continue in a similar way. Let's expect, I mean, her government is going to begin in October. So it's an interesting moment in which basically there are two presidents, and the one, of course, the current president and the elected one. Maybe she's going to be a little strategic, not to I don't know, change her very successful political alliance with López Obrador. But let's see what happens in October. Maybe she's going to find her own positions in all of these. In some ways, she has a very democratic trajectory, a very democratic history. If you see her bio, Claudia Sheinbaum, she was a scholar. She worked at the university for many years. She was a scientist. Eventually, she joined the López Obrador movement. She has been very, very loyal to the López Obrador movement. But the expectation is that her government will not be that, let's say, she will not represent a threat to democracy. Let's see. The signs that she has sent in the last days are not necessarily very good news in terms of, well, she's still endorsing all of these measures that will actively erode Mexican democracy. But I think we should wait until her government starts and see if that's actually going to be actual policy.
All right. And lastly, Professor Cornejo, how do you think a possible win by Donald Trump in the US could affect populist movements in Mexico and in Latin America?
It's interesting because, yeah, López Obrador and Donald Trump had a very good relationship, which people didn't expect that was going to happen. Mostly Donald Trump from the right, López Obrador from the left. Even though they have different ideologies, they meet in some way in the center in terms of populism, in terms of some degree of populism in Donald Trump, and definitely a lot of populism in terms of López Obrador. It has been a very functional relationship between Mexico and the US in the last years. Now also the Biden administration and López Obrador, in the sense that, but what the US needs is that Mexico stops immigration from Central America to the US, and Mexico has done that in a terrible way, I should say, in many ways, not respecting human rights of immigrants. But yeah, that has been somewhat successful for the Biden administration in terms of Mexico being in some way the wall between the two countries. In exchange, and I think that's something that everyone assumes, that it's an actual policy in the White House. The White House doesn't care much about democratic erosion in Mexico. If Mexico is, let's say, successful in stopping immigration, or at least slowing the pace of immigration between Mexico and the US, they will not care much about democratic erosion. The US wants stability more than democracy in Mexico, and that has always been the case, even during the, I don't know, like 70 years of the hegemonic party regime in Mexico in the last century. At some point, yes, the US was interested in Mexico being democratic, but more interested, it's always, the main interest is that Mexico is stable, politically stable. So I think that's at the end of the day the most important concern of the US. If López Obrador at some point didn't quite respect some of the NAFTA agreements, but there were some disagreements between the government, but at the very least they negotiated. At the end of the day, the immigration concern is the most important one for first the Trump administration, eventually the Biden administration, and again, Mexico had been very, well, the López Obrador administration has been very smart in terms of their own interest of don't criticize the non-democratic trajectory of our administration.
Professor Cornejo, thank you so much for your time. I appreciate that.
Thanks a lot for the invitation.
Can I kindly ask you a photo of yours?
Yeah, of course.
Yeah, please send a photo with a high resolution, Professor.
Exactly. I can send you the picture. Yep.
Thank you. All the best.